Hello and welcome. In this video we'll continue looking into the Warzone Charadon rules for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces. In this case we'll be looking at the rules for the Forge World of Metalica. One thing I'll say is when I originally talked about the different Forge Worlds, I was very harsh on the Metalica Forge World and rated it as one of the lowest, if not the lowest, Forge World that was an option to the Adeptus Mechanicus. However, with the advent of the Warzone Charadon rules, I will say this much, is that Metalica would at the very least place within the top 5 of different Forge Worlds, if for no other reason than how much they gained within the Warzone Charadon rules in terms of abilities they can take. As for what they gained 3 different things, being a trait, relics, and stratagems. In this video we'll cover each one of those and look at what they can do within a game. To begin with, the Metalica forces have gained 3 different Warlord traits, and while none of these Warlord traits are preferable to the Holy Order Warlord traits, they are still rather good and I can see a lot of interesting things that can be done with them in the future. Now to begin with, the first trait they gain is called the Master Annihilator trait, and what this allows you to do is to pick a unit within 6 inches of your Warlord that is armed with a radium weapon and give them 1 additional strength to their weapon as well as 6 inches of range. However, the range increase does not stack with other abilities that increase the range of weapons. This is actually a rather powerful ability in theory because the Vanguard can get quite a few shots off with the radium carbines, and you can also influence the radium Giselle, which is a rather interesting weapon but is somewhat weak within the 8th edition codex. However, in the 9th edition codex it seems to have gone a significant improvement, though I'll wait on making any judgments on that yet until I see the points value as well as the other abilities that weapon may have, as it could end up being very good or very bad depending on the circumstances that we have not seen yet so far for that model. And if the radium Giselle and the radium carbines continue to be rather good, as well as Vanguard being a rather cheap option, this can definitely be an ability you can use on certain models just to give your Vanguard a little bit more of a punch. One thing I'll say is I hope that when the Skitarii Marshal comes out, he has an ability similar to this, or Emotionless Clarity, as it would be a very good way to make the Vanguard significantly more frightening and give us an HQ that works very well with the Vanguard units. I'll also hope there's a version for the Skitarii Rangers, as it would be nice to have 2 different models instead of having both abilities on one model, as you can easily run into a situation where if you put both abilities on one model, one ability might not be as strong as the other, and the model has to be balanced around that ability. Although, if they make this ability related to an item that the Skitarii Marshal can carry, it would be an interesting way of fixing that, because all of a sudden you can make the items different point values, and that way you can adjust for each one individually while having the ability to reduce the number of kits you need to build different models, which is always a good benefit because the more you can do with one of your model kits, the better off they are. Following the Master Annihilator trait, there is the Ash Runner trait, which adds 3 inches to the Warlord's movement speed and gives the Warlord 1 additional strength. The nice thing about this 1 additional strength is that when you couple it with a Canticle that adds another additional strength, you actually begin to get quite a high strength value on some of our models, such as the Engine Seer or the Manipulus, and both those models can be rather okay within melee combat, especially when armed with something like the Anzion's Pseudo Generator. And as such, I think it's an ability that is very good already, and it will continue getting better as we gain more characters that can carry this Warlord trait. It is a little sad that we don't have any dedicated melee HQs, as this would be very impressive on one of those, but who knows when we might get one that can perform very well within melee, and this all of a sudden becomes a Warlord trait that is incredibly powerful as opposed to just being very good at the time. And finally, the third trait is the Radioactive Emanations trait, which says that non-Metalica units within 6 inches of the Warlord get -1 to their toughness, and this -1 does not stack with the abilities of Rad Saturation on the Vanguard or Rad Bombardment in the Defense Cohort, for example. The wording on this ability is actually really interesting because the way it's worded, it sounds like even friendly units within your army would get -1 to their toughness if they're from a different Forge World, so it is a little more restrictive than normal, and it could potentially hurt you as it does not have the enemy model's clause within it. Anyway, it's an interesting ability. I don't think it's particularly that great, as I think there are better ways of achieving it, and I would prefer Ash Runner out of all these abilities, as well as the Holy Order Warlord traits, which supersede all of these to begin with. So if I had to rank these in any kind of order, I would say Ash Runner takes the first place, and Master Annihilator plus Radioactive Emanations kind of fit a similar role, and you might see use for one or the other at times. However, I do think Master Annihilator beats out Radioactive Emanation very slightly, as it can make the Vanguard and potentially the Dragoons a much more serious threat, and especially if the Radium Giselle Dragoons gain some power within the 9th edition codex, it can really become an ability that's rather devastating. Moving on from the traits, the Metalica Forge World has gained 4 different relics from the Warzone Charadon book, and the first relic on this list is the Omni Sterilizer, which replaces an Eradication Ray on a Dominus model, and it has the same range as the Eradication Ray at 24 inches, the same strength profile at strength 6, and it has the same number of shots at D3 shots. However, it becomes an assault weapon as opposed to a heavy weapon, which gives it a lot more utility, as now you can advance and shoot. More so, it doubles the armor penetration of the Eradication Ray, going up to 4 armor penetration instead of 2, and the damage goes goes to 3 damage flat, although it is a blast weapon as opposed to the Eradication Ray, which has a damage of 1. Additionally, the Eradication Ray can catch up to the Omni Sterilizer in many ways, as Eradication Ray becomes 4 armor penetration within 8 inches and a damage profile of D3 within that 8-inch range. All in all, I think it's a decent relic, and I think it's one that gives the Dominus a little bit more utility. I still like the Forge Fire relic a lot more than this, but I do think it's a step in the right direction, giving some of our models a little bit more ability to put out damage as opposed to just being aura buff units. Moving on, we have a relic that's incredibly powerful, and it's called Bionics of Veneration. And what the Bionics of Veneration does is that it gives the bearer a 4+ invulnerable save, and in addition to that, the bearer gains an aura, which gives enemies -1 to hit on their hit roll when they're within 3 inches of a unit with the Bionics of Veneration. I think this is very powerful, and Metalica is definitely a Forge World that likes being within close combat. Additionally, the 4+ invulnerable save is very nice, and it can make a unit very resilient. Once again, if you combine the Bionics of Veneration with the Ash Runner, if we do get a melee-focused character, these two in combination can be very powerful, especially when escorting a unit of melee threats. I think the Ash Runner ability as well as the Bionics of Veneration already boost Metalica up significantly from where it used to be, and there's still plenty more to cover as there's a ton of things that Metalica can benefit from. Now, the third relic is the Delta Pistol, and I'll be honest, this relic doesn't really excite me because it's restricted to a unit with a Gamma Pistol, and the only unit I can think off the top of my head who has one is the Cybernetica Datasmith. So as it stands within the 8th edition codex, I don't think this is very playable, as generally you don't want a Datasmith in your army simply because of how much he costs and how little he does. Though there have been cases where they have shown up in tournaments, I don't think they're really important to a Metalica army, and all the Delta Pistol really does is increase the Gamma Pistol strength to 10, give it 1 additional armor penetration bringing up to an armor penetration of 4, and it doubles the damage to a damage profile of 4. I should mention it does increase the range by 6 inches, making it have a range of 18 inches. However, it still has the very real problem that it still only has 1 shot, and the Datasmith is not the most impressive model to begin with. Well, hopefully in 9th edition we'll see something change that makes the Datasmith a much more interesting model to use. For the final relic, we have another relic that's very interesting, and that is the Metalican Lung. And what the Metalican Lung does is that when a Metalica unit shoots at an enemy within 3 inches of a bearer of the Metallic Lung, the Metalica unit targeting the enemy that is within 3 inches of the Metalican Lung can reroll wound rolls. This is once again a very powerful unit, and combined with something like Ash Runner, you can get this in range very quickly. And do note that the unit itself that's targeting the enemy within 3 inches of the Metalican Lung does not have to be within 3 inches itself, so you can position the bearer of this item within range of an enemy unit and then target it with a unit that's quite a distance away. So it's much better than it seems at first reading, and I think it's an item that can be very good in many cases and continue making the Metalica Forge World a very powerful force to be reckoned with, as the Bionics of Veneration, the Metalican Lung, and the Ash Runner ability all work very well together. Although you can't pair the Metalican Lung with the Bionics of Veneration, as both are a relic, they're still both rather good relics, and considering how weak our relics are, it's not a bad item to have. Finally, we come to the special stratagems that the Metalica Forge World gets within the Warzone Charadon rules, and I think these are some very powerful stratagems that can do a lot of work and probably will continue to contribute to Metalica being a top-end Forge World. And this is why I wouldn't be too upset if something like the Master Annihilator ability is found on a Skitarii Marshal, because while it will take away from Metalica a little bit, Metalica will still have a ton of different abilities and a ton of variety that other Forge Worlds don't get. As I doubt we'll see a situation in which the other Forge Worlds gain this much utility from the main codex itself, as usually they only gain 1 stratagem, 1 relic, and 1 stratagem within the main codex. So Metalica gets quite a lot more than any other Forge World, and I think that will continue keeping Metalica high up in the rankings simply because of how much they have access to in this situation. Now, getting into the stratagems, the first stratagem on the list is the Rad Oversaturation stratagem, which allows you to increase the Rad Saturation aura ability on the Vanguard to 6 inches for a cost of 2 command points until the end of the phase. And while this is a rather expensive stratagem in some senses, being able to give -1 toughness to enemy units within 6 inches of a Vanguard squad can be incredibly devastating, as that can allow your heavy weapon fire to really target those units and take them out very easily. I think this is definitely very good for any Metalica army, including Vanguard units, which you probably will be because the Vanguard do benefit in Metalica very heavily. Following that stratagem, there is the March to War stratagem, which costs 1 command point, and it says when you make a move to advance, instead of rolling, you automatically add 6 inches to the advance movement of the unit. This can be very powerful, especially considering the current dogma of the Metalica forces, which reduces the penalty of firing weapons after advancing. All in all, this gives Metalica a ton of mobility, once again mentioning the Ash Runner ability, which allows a Warlord to keep up with whatever unit you use this on, and I think this is a very powerful ability, especially considering that mobility is at a premium within the 9th edition rules, considering how objectives work and everything else. So I can see that continuing to be something that pushes Metalica up to the top tables. Then we have the Purity of the Machine stratagem, which is 1 command point, and you can use it within your shooting or fight phase. And it says that you ignore all hit and wound modifiers to attacks made by the unit that you have chosen with this ability. And one other caveat is if you choose a vehicle for this ability, it does increase the command point cost up to 2 command points. So if you're using this on something like Castle on Robots, it can really easily add up really quickly, considering how command point hungry the Admech can be in many cases. After that, we have the Order and Anarchy stratagem, which for 1 command point gives you +1 to hit when making attacks against enemies within 12 inches. And this pairs very nicely with what Metalica wants to do already, as it wants to get its units in close to debuff the enemies with its different auras, and it also has a special mechanical which says that enemies gain -1 to hit when making attacks against Metalica units within 12 inches. So once again, you're going to find yourself within 12 inches of enemy forces quite often, meaning that you're going to have quite a lot of opportunities to use the Order and Anarchy stratagem, so it's rather great in that sense. Extinction Order is another stratagem that they gain, and it's their most expensive one at 3 command points. What it does is you select a terrain feature visible to the Warlord, and units within 6 inches of your Warlord get +1 to wound when making attacks targeting units completely within that terrain feature. This sounds like a very good ability, and it probably is in a lot of cases, as it can really help the wound roll on your units, though keep in mind that something like the Rad Oversaturation can do very much the same thing, and there are other stratagems for less points that allow you to gain similar benefits. Granted, you can use something like Rad Saturation in conjunction with this ability in order to stack the benefits to wound the enemy very easily. However, I think in most cases, most of our firepower is going to be strong enough that it can wound enemies rather easily as it is, and you'll only really need one or the other in order to get the same results or good enough results to do enough damage to your opponent. However, the nice thing about this is the range of this is mostly unlimited in comparison to something like Rad Oversaturation, which requires you to have a Vanguard squad within 6 inches of an enemy, and as such there is a nice amount of utility to this, which accounts for the very high command point cost of this ability, so it's definitely one you don't want to discount when playing the game. Then there's the Omnicide Exaltation stratagem, which for 1 command point reduces the effectiveness of combat attrition tests of enemies near Metalica units, not too far off from the Metalica stratagem we have in the current codex. And I'll say this much, I don't think it's that interesting of a stratagem. It'll have situations in which it does something, but I'm not the most sold on it. I think it's one of those stratagems that you're going to mostly ignore, but there are going to be some situations where it does play a role in the game, and it's not bad in that situation, so hey, at least it's something in that sense. Then, following the Omnicide Exaltation, there's Blaring Glory, which for 1 command point turns off all the rerolls during shooting or the fight phase of enemy units within 6 inches of a selected Metalica unit. Now, this is actually a rather powerful ability, as it can really hurt some enemy units that rely on rerolls in different ways. One thing to consider is something like the Flyer, which can utilize this stratagem, as well as being able to shut down aura abilities as a whole and be very fast moving, while also hanging out in front of an enemy without actually being engaged with that enemy, so that it can debuff them while being very close to them. And I think it's going to be an ability that you can utilize very heavily for the low command point cost in order to really annoy your opponent, who all of a sudden has to continuously move out of range of some of your flyers or try to target and destroy them, despite them being a rather resilient unit that can be rather annoying to take out if you don't have the right army composition. I do think if this flyer stratagem becomes popular, you'll start seeing more dune crawlers armed with Icarus rays in different armies of the Admech as a whole, simply because they have a much easier time taking out flying units than any other type of unit and have a good amount of firepower that can potentially destroy an Archaeopter very quickly. There's also one last stratagem that the Metalica Forge World gained, which is Knights of the Iron Cog, and what it says is for 1 command point, before the battle you can select the House Raven unit, and it gains the Canticles of the Omnicide ability as well as the Adeptus Mechanicus keyword. This last line is very important, as if you remember our talk about the defense cohort, units that do not have the Adeptus Mechanicus keyword cannot be included within the defense cohort. However, in this situation, as all of a sudden the knight has it, and as the stratagem states that the unit can be taken within armies that require every unit to have the Adeptus Mechanicus keyword, you can all of a sudden take a knight within a defense cohort army, and it will be a very interesting application of the knight within that army, as you have incredibly tanky Cataphrons as well as Castellans that can move around the table and can hold objectives despite having very small unit sizes very resiliently, while the knight moves around the table and provides a heavy output of damage, while also just being a general threat to anything in its path. So I think this ability is the most interesting when paired with something like the defense cohort, as someone mentioned within the comments of my defense cohort video, and that's something I hadn't really thought about at the time, simply because I hadn't thought of this ability, and at the time I thought Questor Mechanicus could not be taken within something like the defense cohort due to the restriction of not having the Adeptus Mechanicus keyword. However, in this situation it seems like they've solved for that. I wonder if when the 9th edition codex comes out, we'll see a similar ability for all of the different Questor Mechanicus units, or if we'll still have the same restrictions as we do now It'd be interesting to see a stratagem that allows us to take knights a lot more easily within our forces, to allow us to couple knights with the Adeptus Mechanicus without having to really alter army or pay an incredible amount of command points. In any case, I do think the changes in Warzone Charadon for Metalica have really revitalized the Forge World, and in some cases we've already seen it perform rather well within tournaments. I do hope the 9th edition Codex keeps some of these trends and continues on with some of the things we've seen here, as it does show that a Forge World can be made very powerful simply by being given a lot of different choices, as opposed to being given one very powerful dogma or something of that nature. So it's always nice to see more variety where you have more optionality that gives you the power level of your units, as opposed to simply raw power as we get with the dogmas. Though in either case, I do think Metalica will be in the top 5 Forge Worlds with the 9th edition as a result of these changes, and it'll be nice because I don't think it will take away from any of the Forge Worlds. I think it'll simply give you more options, which is always also very good, because all of a sudden you're not losing anything, but you're gaining a whole lot as a result of this. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this video or any of the other videos on my channel, please do share the content, as it can help other players out in terms of buying and building an army. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, you guys are awesome people. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.